Who is Ella Owen?
Yeah, so Ella is the head of trust and safety at Twitter. So she's essentially in charge of a lot of the teams that work on, keeping Twitter safe, right? They used to fight misinformation. They used to take down hate speech. This is the same group that, for example, was responsible for suspending President Donald Trump a few years ago, right? And so this is a pretty high-profile job. A lot of these decisions we've seen be very controversial over the years. So the person who kind of runs trust and safety at Twitter has always been a high-profile role in that regard because the decisions that are made are so important to free speech on the internet, right? And so she stepped into a very senior position under Elon in just the last couple months.
Well, that was what I found so interesting about this. You and I have done a lot of reporting together over recent months, and more than recent months, honestly. And that was a name I didn't recognize. We documented on a day-by-day basis the people leaving Twitter, those that chose to stay. So now my question is, what is it that she's doing? What is the crux of your big take story that you've learned about her role within the building?
Yeah, well, you probably aren't familiar with her name because she really just joined Twitter over the summer, just a few months before Elon Musk took over, right? So she was not necessarily a senior leader in the way that a lot of employees were, or someone who a lot of employees were familiar with by the time that the deal closed, right? But what we, pointed out in our big take, and why I think this is an interesting story, is that they're kind of bucking a lot of the trends of trust and safety over at Twitter these days, right? I mean, this is an organization that exists at Facebook and YouTube and all the other social players. And, the last couple of years, we've seen these groups get really refined, right? They have tons of policies. They have tons of procedures. There's kind of a standard way of doing some of this stuff, right? And under Elon, a lot of that has gotten thrown out the window. And so we've seen, for example, they just got rid of their COVID misinformation policies. One example, you may remember, Ed, a few weeks ago, they just started suspending journalists. Sort of without a great explanation, right? And so what we've seen is just kind of like this playbook that I think a lot of folks are familiar with get tossed out, and that's why we find it interesting.
Well, give us some sort of granularity around the decisions or actions that she is carrying out, I suppose, on Elon Musk's behalf.
Yeah, well, typically these types of things would go through a strict process, right? They might go through multiple teams, multiple layers, certainly multiple levels of review. And what we've seen and what we mentioned in our story was that, we've seen screenshots of things like, hey, we want this account suspended on the order of Elon, or we want this suspended on the order of Ella, right? And these are just, again, not the way that usually these checks and balances tend to work. And so there's a lot of people in the world of trust and safety who are worried that there's simply just too much power being held by one or two people here in this instance. And that, if they're not following a lot of these checks and balances that we're used to, you don't know exactly where that's going to end up, right? And again, these journalists being sort of suspended out of the blue is just one example, but you could imagine that being extrapolated to a bunch of different accounts.
Her rise, or indeed her remaining, how have people talked about that and the way in which she's navigated her career at Twitter?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the issue is not at all that Ella is incompetent or anything like that. I mean, she's had a bunch of really strong roles at tech companies before. She's described to us as an incredible operator, someone who's very organized, who's very passionate, who's very, emotional about the things that she cares about. But I don't think she had much experience doing speech policy, right? Like a lot of times we'll see with trust and safety, they're academics or they're lawyers or they're people who have maybe spent their whole life thinking about things like Section 230. That is not Ella's background, right? And so I think there was a little bit of concern again from people who were within Twitter's trust and safety, but even just like the broader industry that, she's now in a role that requires that type of nuance. And, it's something that you build over time. And I'm just not sure that she's been in that role long enough, especially with Elon and how he operates, that it's instilling a lot of confidence in people right now.